Hello team, just come out of Dune Part 2, which I've been saying is, I've been calling June Part 2, and everyone's been going, June? What are you going to say, June? The month of June? And I'm like, no, June, and then they only get me when I go Dune, or Dune, which feels weird, but apparently I'm pronouncing it wrong. It's kind of like all my life, I've called cashew nuts, and everyone laughs at me because they say it's cashew. And I'm like, well, that's the same. You know what I'm saying? But anyway, apparently it's not June Part 2, but whatever. I saw it in IMAX, BFI IMAX. Seat H16. No, H18. It was a great seat. And I had a nice pot of overnight oats as the trailers were on. So I was well fed. I was a happy boy. I'm a fan of June Part 1. I really love Denis Villeneuve in general, and Dune is one of my favourites of his, even though they're all great, to be honest. So I was very much excited for this. Tried to ignore reviews in advance, but did get a sense through like glimpses on tube posts and stuff that like it was going to be pretty good. And yeah, it was pretty good. I felt like it was 2 hour 46-minute film that didn't really feel like that. And although they're very different films, I compared it directly to, in the same cinema, at a similar morning showing, seeing Oppenheimer back last year. And I loved Oppenheimer, but I did feel like the final hour dragged and blah, blah, blah. And yeah, with this, I felt like it was paced really well. And I didn't get that kind of fatigue towards the end. I think there was only like a 10-20 minute period, kind of 2/3 in, that I felt could have been contracted a little bit. And it was specifically when kind of Paul, the Fremen had kind of decided that Paul was the Messiah, but Paul was still reticent to like lead them anywhere. And there was kind of like 20 minutes when nothing much really went on. I mean, I guess it was kind of just before Josh Brolin came back. But other than that, I thought it was really, really well paced, and like there was some like spectacular scenes in it. Like, for example, I think only Denis Villeneuve currently could make someone riding on a sandworm not ridiculous and hilarious. Like, he sold it, and that was incredible. I loved all the performances. I'd say my favourite performances were, first of all, Timothée Chalamet. I'm not the biggest fan of Timothée Chalamet, but I do think that like the way he dealt with the transition between Paul Atreides to then being like a member of the Fremen, to then being the leader of the Fremen, and then coming full circle on his Atreides Harkonnen like legacy, or whatever you'd call it, heritage. He did that so well. Like the way he like assumed this role as a leader, I felt he really dealt with that well. And like that's not an easy thing to do, because I mean put it this way, if you didn't believe in that transition of the main character, of that main performance, then the whole film's fucked, obviously. I mean, it's not reinventing the wheel to say it, but he carries the film, and I think he does it in quite an understated way until he needs to overstate it. Like, until he's the leader, he really does sit back really well in a way that's also charismatic. I wasn't as sold on his romance with Zendaya, but I do think Zendaya sold it better than he did. Like, I really believed in her love for him. But my favourite performance was Javier Bardem as one of the Fremen, because he brought like this kind of much needed levity in the early stages that I think like the franchise lacks a little bit. Now I'm talking to someone who hasn't read the book, and I understand the tone of the book is very serious, and the film's really like they sound like they're really faithful to that. But I was talking with my friend when we were coming out, and we were saying like this feels like a generational movement as a franchise in a similar way to how Lord of the Rings felt like to us millennials back in the day. Not Harry Potter, that's different. Lord of the Rings, like a kind of monumental, serious fantasy franchise that can double up as both like children's entertainment but also really adult and mature entertainment. And this feels like that. This Dune franchise feels like a special moment. And if you compare them both directly, it feels like Lord of the Rings has a better tapestry of tones and genres within it. And I think Dune maybe lacks the levity that Lord of the Rings can sometimes have. But they're different worlds. I get that. I get that, like, they can't be the same. I don't want Dune to just suddenly have some cheeky fucking character for no reason. But I'm just saying Javier Bardem brought that to his role in a way that might not have even been in the script so much. You know, he really brought that, and I think it needed it. And I thought he absolutely smashed it. I loved... I think... sorry, moving on from the performances. I think my main criticism is... it didn't feel as brooding and creepy as the first film, which is weird, given that there's so much stuff around the Reverend Mothers and Austin Butler as like this Harkonnen nephew who's like tapped. There's a lot of like creepy scenes, but I didn't feel creeped out, and I didn't feel that like the weight of that darkness as much as in the first film. Weirdly, even though the first film has far less of those dynamics, really, in the script, it feels like. I just felt the first film had like an aura of like fear at times, like especially with the hand in the box scene, and meeting the Fremen felt really threatening. And I don't think the second film, sorry, I'm just walking around and around. I don't think the second film hit those touch points as well for me. And I do think that is a failing. And I don't think that's like not in the script. Like, I think it is in the story of this film, but wasn't hit as well. Yeah, that's a shame. I think I missed some of those elements. And maybe, look, maybe, you know, some of those elements being like the voice, you know, is like a creepy thing, or like the Reverend Mothers were like more accessible in this, whereas in the first one there's just that single scene that's very like enigmatic. And like maybe, you know, maybe that is the way the story should develop, and maybe things are more clear for the characters and for the audience, and, you know, as Timothée Chalamet's character gets more familiar with it. But I missed it, and so I had a really good time in Dune Part 2, but I would say I think I prefer Dune Part 1, you know, only by a hair, and I think they're both brilliant films. I do feel as though I'm a bit blue-balled by the ending, and I'm annoyed about that. Like, I'm annoyed at the end of the first film. It was clear they were setting up the end of the first book in the second film, and that's fair enough. You know, you got part 1, part 2 of one book. But I wanted a resolution at the end of this film, again, as someone who hasn't read the books, just aware that it was one book. And they're setting up the next film with like this idea of the Holy War and stuff, and the Zendaya being annoyed. Zendaya being annoyed is the setup for the next film, because her storyline isn't resolved, and blah blah blah. And look, I'm not saying I don't want another film, I really do, but I just wish that they wouldn't have used those last 2 minutes to set it up, because I feel edged again. I'm like, why can't I just pay my money to see a story come to a resolution, and then do another one, you know, but set that up at the start of the next film. You know, remind us where those characters are. I just, yeah, that annoyed me. And on that note, I really want Denis Villeneuve to actually move on, because you know, if you think about, I don't know, Peter Jackson doing Lord of the Rings, I think it kind of took it out of him, really. And James Cameron now doing Avatar, feels like a real, to me, I'm not a huge fan of Avatar, it feels like a real waste of those talents. You think about Sam Mendes doing those 2 Bond films, like, I think he was better served leaving them after 2. And Christopher Nolan doing the Batman films is probably the best example. You know, one of the best filmmakers of our generation at the start of what has now been a long prime period, strapped to like a franchise like that. And it ended up that the 3rd film, I think we're all agreed, really wasn't that good. The 3rd Batman is really, really weak, and I think it can really take it out of these great directors, you know, however creative and brilliant they are. Can they serve a franchise, even though Denis loves it, can he serve a franchise to that exhaustive level for what will be a decade by the time he finishes a 3rd film? When we know from his past work that he has things like Sicario in his locker, things like Prisoners in his locker, and you know, non-sci-fi stuff, or even, you know, original sci-fi like Arrival. Like, he can do those things, and I want him to do those things. I don't want him to use more of his prime period making a 3rd film in a franchise, which is a brilliant franchise that I love. But I would also love, now this book's over, for it to be handed over to an equally able director, and for Denis to move on to more independent works. I don't mean independent studio-wise, I mean independent in terms of his creativity. That's just my opinion. So, yeah. But yeah, really enjoyed Dune Part 2. Yeah, I always say this, but if I was given a rating for a magazine or whatever, then I would definitely give it a 5 stars out of 5. My own ratings I rate out of 10, my personal preference. And yeah, I'll be giving it a 7 out of 10. Enjoyed it. Thanks very much.